In the 90s, suddenly this new phenomena appeared in advertising where the husband was always portrayed as a total goof and the woman always saved the day. Kind of a weird idea because it's so implausible.
It makes total sense for me that as technology advances faster than we're able to keep up with it, we do feel a little bit childlike and a little bit helpless.
So men have been complicit in this, in this sort of definition of themselves as idiots. At least research now is showing us.
Robert, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for asking me. Glad to be here.
And as I was saying to you before I hit record, I could have chosen so many of your different blogs and articles and books that you've worked on to discuss, and I'm sure there'll be room for us to do that again in the future. But I wanted to focus on one that really stood out to me, particularly as a 30-year-old man in the modern world. But you wrote over 20 years ago now about being a man in the lousy modern world. At that time, that was 2002 or something like that. I think it was published. You've been working on it. What inspired you to write a book with that title?
Actually, the title, it was originally going to be called The Hemingway Complex, which I still prefer as a title, but the publishers forced the Being a Man on me, which sounded a bit wet. And so I managed to finagle my way into the subtitle of In the Lousy Modern World, which was a quote I got from Tony Parsons, who's a writer I really admire, especially his book Man and Boy, which came out about the same time, maybe a bit sooner. But so that's where the sort of title. But the idea came about twofold. One, I wanted to write about lots of small adventures I had, that none of which really added up to a book-length adventure, but I thought that they would be worth writing about. And secondly, I'd become increasingly irritated because in the 90s, the idea came to me in a sort of, I don't know, about 1998 or something. But in the 90s, suddenly this new phenomena appeared in advertising where the husband was always portrayed as a total goof and the woman always saved the day. And it's a really common trope. It's so accepted now in advertising and in sitcoms and so on. I mean, there's been some slight readjustment, but at that time it was a kind of a novelty because in sort of 50s and 60s advertising, the dad was seen as a competent person and the mum was in charge of the home, so it's more traditional. And it's got me to.
I think there's been a big shift in that in a lot of regards. It wouldn't just be advertising, Robert, but even like films and media and even books as well.
I mean, look at Ken, poor old Ken in Ken and Barbie. Not that I've seen the film, but my wife and daughter went to see it last night and they came back and they said, Ken is a douchebag. But if he is one, why do they give him so much screen time? It's like, what's going on? You can't have it both ways. Anyway, no, it's a common trope. And I mean, Greg Iles is an American writer I really admire, love his stuff. But even he succumbs in this book, Natchez Burning. In the end, there's a sort of an incredible showdown, but it's the woman who tackles the bad guys rather than the guy. Now, the guy he's a lawyer and writer, so it seems implausible that he would suddenly be able to sort of slash someone's throat with a razor, which is what the weapon is. But his girlfriend does, and we kind of believe it because this sort of whole model of a sort of like, if a woman's anger, a righteous woman's anger is raised up, she will become a killer, much more ferocious than a man. And I just think it's kind of a weird idea because it's so implausible. I mean, strength-wise, it would be just an implausibility, and unless the woman had some martial arts training, why? I mean, I suppose the only thing you're talking about there is the sort of the willingness to kill someone. So women are more murderous than men, but it's sort of accepted, and he wrote it in the book, and I'm kind of accepting it because I think it was a bit implausible if him as a lawyer did something like that. So it has changed.
Yes, but during that period then when men are maybe having their role in society change to be a bit more of the jovial fool or less competent or less able to do things, that gets you thinking that you may need to write about that and about why that is and maybe how to push back against it.
I thought it's just wrong. when things break in my house, or most people's houses, it's the bloke who is quite happy to go and fix things, uh, and that's just because they prefer doing it, and usually they're better at doing it, and that's life.
There's an element of people pushing back so hard against traditional gender roles and quote unquote stereotypes, and I find it unusual because they do come to bear in so many different situations. And you were mentioning a book there. I know that as a child in the early 1990s, my parents would read me books where a lot of the time the male protagonist was the hero and was strong. And I was seeing recently that Roald Dahl is becoming increasingly a target for the politically correct in terms of either rewriting his texts or asking them not to be read to children. But I know, for example, in Fantastic Mr. Fox and Danny Champion of the World, albeit that sometimes the characters had a little bit of a nefarious streak and liked to get up to nonsense, the man was a competent role model, and he was loyal, and he was strong, and he was probably a concept of what we would call a positive expression of masculinity at that time. And that was the kind of books that I was reading. So I can see why, if we are maybe perhaps moving towards this changing of the role of men, that's not how they are illustrated in novels or books or stories nowadays.
Yeah, I mean it's complicated, but it's sort of to do with. I mean, for a start, men have willingly given up that role because they feel pretty cool about it, and it is at the beginning. It seems pretty cool to be able to say, "Oh yeah, I'm not really good at anything, and my wife is brilliant." And it seems really nice and even-handed, and nice to be promoting women and helping them, even if they may not be that good at fixing the drains. Basically, saying they could be good at fixing the drains. So it seems kind of good. So men have been complicit in this in this sort of definition of themselves as idiots. But it's complicated because in everyday life, a lot of the skills that men are good at. I mean, I remember my great aunt saying her husband had been abusive to her, and he died really quite young, so she was quite pleased about that. And but I remember her saying when she was 100, "What do you need a man for, apart from to change a light bulb?" Because he's tall, and can reach up and change a light bulb. So you can sort of fully understand we've created this world in which we live, where a bloke who's stronger and maybe more aggressive and has an interest in fixing things is pretty redundant. You don't need to fix things. Everything comes ready-made, or you buy a new one. Your main role in life is to be very cautious and risk-averse, because that, you pay more insurance, you buy all kinds of safety gadgets, you spend your time being scared of things and staying indoors and watching Netflix all the time. It's a world in which many sort of traditionally male attributes are just not needed. So it's kind of understandable.
They're stifled a
Yeah.
little bit as well. It's interesting you mentioned males not being needed in the same way. Like your great aunt joked about changing the light bulb or maybe fixing drains. I think was the other example that you gave. Technology is something you wrote about to some extent, and that was back in the early 2000s. But that's certainly increased to an extent where we are a little bit less important. And when you were writing about technology, you were writing from an aspect of almost keeping people as infants or as children, which is quite an interesting concept. So what led you to think around that?
I mean, it's there comes a point when you've got a piece of equipment that's so complicated you don't even dare try and open it. But I did manage to use my Hoover, which has a very tiny little thin sucking device you can put on it, to suck out the fluff from my laptop fan, which apparently is a tricky thing to do, and you shouldn't really do it. So I felt really good about that, but that's about as far as I'd go. And
you used 2 bits of technology there, Robert. Surely that's cheating.
But no, the technology thing is, I think people have to find their own sort of level of comfort with what they can fix or repair. And for me, it started with fixing bicycles and things like that. And I never graduated. I've had a motorcycle. I took it apart. I got it working once, and then and then it sort of went wrong, and it was really, really. I bought it for £2 off this kid. It was a knackered thing, and so I'd really reached my kind of level of technology. But I knew people who went way beyond that, to cars and all kinds of things. Got jobs with Rolls Royce. So everybody. But what happens now is that even with bikes now, they are fixable, but there's special tools to do this bit and that bit, and so you just give up. I mean, when I first heard that somebody actually had their bike serviced, I thought that's absurd. A bike is such a simple thing, but yeah, you get it serviced, because it's got complicated bits. So, I suppose what I'm saying is that if you live in an extremely a world which in order to do your everyday life, you're using all kinds of complicated technology which you cannot understand or fix, you're going to feel a little bit redundant and a little bit ham-fisted. So I'm
almost like a child, because you would need the support of the adults or the qualified or the technicians to do anything to fix. It was a really challenging thing for me to read that point, because I am a big advocate of the progression of technology, but I also have huge respect, particularly over the last 200 odd podcasts that I've recorded. I've learned a lot about how important our ancestral programming and our evolutionary psychology is, and the further we get away from it, unfortunately we're not adapting at the same rate. So it makes total sense for me that as technology advances faster than we're able to keep up with it, we do feel a little bit childlike and a little bit helpless, because we aren't able to control some of the things. So we can joke about it, you were unable to fix your laptop, but when our laptop breaks, we actually are a little bit powerless for a day, 2 days, until we're able to go into the Apple store or wherever we're going, and we see the gurus there, and they're able to put the arm around the shoulder. It's okay, son, I'll fix this for you. And you could be a 50, 60, 80-year-old man, whatever age, and you're unable to move things forward and help yourself.
No, that's true. And I think that we're probably still adapting. I mean, all these technologies are brand new. If you think about printing and the revolution that the widespread distribution of books had over hundreds of years, first of all in religion and then technology and science and all sorts of things, we've only had the internet for 20 years. And there's going to be huge, huge repercussions over the next 100 years. So we're really just learning to live with it and learning to live with toxicity. I believe that many forms in which we take information now are actually toxic, in the same way that too much sugar is toxic. It's super refined, and you've got to be careful how much you have. And we've discovered that over 100 years of people having their teeth drop out and all sorts of things. I think we're going to find we're taking in very refined information through these technologies we've got. You think about very complex computer games or movies and things like that. It's producing extremely seductive and refined information, and I think will have a damaging effect on us. It is already, actually.
It's the volume of content, as you say, because we're producing so much more. Because, it's quite funny that I'm very fortunate to have used the technology to create a podcast that reaches thousands of people that can work on their self-development and their mindset and their health. But if you do go on YouTube, there's not just that type of content. There's all sorts of junk, and you're taking it in at such a fast rate, and it's being produced at such a fast rate that it's currently always refreshing and coming again and again and again. And it is in sharp contrast to books, where there's a lot longer and harder barrier to entry to produce that. So a lot of people talk about that Lindy effect, where an awful lot of what we consume nowadays is made within the last 24 hours, and then thereafter it's discarded, whereas many of the books we read, and the one that we're talking about today, is over 20 years old. So they have a much more lasting impact because of perhaps the effort that went into creating them.
Yeah, I mean, it's true. That the more effort you have to put into something. I mean, I am a huge fan of YouTube videos that help you do things and fix things you could. I mean, that's again the sort of the paradox. Technology, at one point empowers us, and then it can trip us up and enslave us. So your podcast can reach lots of people, but you're having to use very advanced technology. A YouTube video, maybe it's time wasting for some, but it enables others to go out and do things they would never be able to do. I mean, YouTube videos have revolutionized the dissemination of a lot of learning, and Mind you, it reminds me of my grandfather. I went to see my grandfather once when he was really old, about 90. And he had the telly on. He said, the television, marvellous tool for education. And I looked at it, it had neighbours on. So it was,
He was
it
learning
was
about
something about
Australian
Australian culture.
culture. When it comes to all this technology, I guess it's advanced even faster in the last 20 years since you wrote the book as well. Like if I think about, I went to university in 2010 and I had a desktop computer, a stack of books, whereas now you probably go with a laptop, maybe a tablet, and all your articles and your journals and everything are all stored
Yeah.
on the computer, and there's far less need for the kind of different heavier items that we have, and technologies move so fast, so much so that like the phone cameras are constantly evolving. Like we can create content of a phenomenal level that previously somebody who had the most state of the art big device
Mhm.
cameras to carry around wouldn't be able to make as well. So I guess with that moving so fast as well, how do you think that's affected men in the last 20 years since you wrote the book initially?
Yeah, I mean, it's a double. First of all, the taking all your information from one source is, uh, I mean, research into brain plasticity has shown that it makes a less lasting impact on you. And so people who, I mean, I had friends who in the first flush of enthusiasm put all their material onto a computer and only looked at things on screen and never read anything except on screen. That's been shown to be bad for your brain because a big part of taking information in is using all the senses. And so a book, you're using your hands, you've got some different perspective. Every book is slightly different. A new book is going to have a bigger impression. So you're actually not doing yourself any services by taking everything in through a screen because the brain very quickly works out that everything is the same. The screen looks the same, the colors look the same, and the content is a really tiny part of it. So at least research now is showing us the more diverse the sources, the better. But in terms of the impact on men, I think in a way it's empowering in some ways. I mean, I think that a lot of people who get into photography now, I mean, in all its aspects, probably would never have done so in the past because it was quite expensive to use film cameras and quite difficult to become good at it because you couldn't take enough pictures. But now you can take thousands of pictures and become a much more competent photographer. So my feeling is you can use the watchword which I used in Being a Man in the Lousy Modern World is: are you using it or is it using you? As And I think it's a really good watchword for technology. Are you being used by it? Are you?
I thought about it as a framework as
Yeah,
well, Robert. So I think about that every time I open social media. Am I doing this of my own volition?
yeah,
Am I going on here to post something that's going to support my audience, that's going to further my ambitions, my aims? Am I using it to consume sources that I consciously want to
yeah,
consume, or am I being hit by the algorithm and just ending up
yeah,
watching not cat videos, but you know the type of
yeah, yeah,
nonsense that can come up in our feed that will keep us on there? And I think it's a really useful framework to use. Am I consciously using this, or am I doing this through compulsion or habit? And has the technology got
yeah,
control of me in that regard? And I think that is a useful thing for both men and
yeah, yeah,
women.
yeah,
It's a
yeah.
thing that we
Of
should all be
course,
thinking
yeah,
about.
yeah, yeah. I know, and yeah, good point.
When you think about being a man in the modern world, Robert, what are some of the challenges and the expectations that are placed upon them that they think they should consider?
The challenges are that it's hard to get a variety of experiences that were fairly common in the past, and you might end up getting to be 30 and really have an impoverished experience base, which is similar to someone who might be 15 in the past or something. And I see there's obviously a huge problem, um, which in the book 20 years ago, I had an intimation about it. I mentioned stuff about mental health, but it has become an explosion. It's brushed under the carpet in so many ways. But for me, men aged 20 to 30, it's just a very difficult time. Usually by 30, people have found their course or path in some way. But those waters are difficult. And I put it down to, I mean, it's really complicated, but quite a bit of it is experience poverty. So you're driven to, because life is providing such a sort of low level of challenge and danger and difficulty that you have to seek out compensation. So you seek it out in drug culture, in drink, what people have always done, go down the pub and get rat-assed and pick fights, escapism of that sort. But it's kind of got a nihilistic and dark edge to it, which claims its victims, and that's the sort of mental health downside of that kind of fight culture, if you like, if you could call it that.
One of the topics around that, Robert, that I've talked about a lot on the podcast over the last 3 years, has particularly for men, has been a loss of purpose and mission. So I think that's certainly something that's been notable in society as well. And I'm sure we'll get on to some of the factors that you talk about within the book, but there's definitely less of a, I don't want to talk about graduation, but like a movement towards and like a ticking off of milestones that really particularly matter, because nowadays those have been watered down quite significantly.
Yeah. I mean, in the book, as a joke, I said, "Oh, what's the rite of passage for a young man now getting his driving license?" I was sort of saying, compared to a tribe in which you have to go out and kill a lion, or or even more extreme ones where you have to go and cut somebody's head off. Not that I'm suggesting somebody should do that, but as a comparison between what was expected in certain cultures, what ours is, passing a driving test. But even now, passing a driving test it's not that common anymore. Lots of people are choosing not to drive for various reasons. Expense, insurance, too many cars on the road anyway. So even these sort of rites of passage have been sort of watered down until there really is no. That's one of the things. We'll probably go on and talk about it maybe a bit. The essence of a rite of passage to sort of signify the end of being a boy, the beginning of becoming a man. That sort of cutoff point has been delayed. Or obfuscated in lots of ways.
You described 4 factors that need to be in place for a man to feel like a man and to be considered a man, and one of those was rite of passage. And as you say, I think there's less tests for people to undergo that have an element of danger or challenge to them in the same way. Like, as you said there, like in a tribal setting, you would maybe have an element of risk and danger to your rite of passage to graduate you from being a boy amongst the tribe to being walking amongst the men and being like that. And as you say, we don't need to reintroduce that level of violence because we're in a far safer society, and there's definitely upsides to that. But our chimp brains aren't thinking like that. They're very much wondering, at what point do I need to feel like I've gone from a boy to man? It's not necessarily your 18th birthday when you're able to go down the pub with whoever and have a legal pint for the first time, because we have a massive drinking culture in the UK at a much younger age than that, I think, certainly when it comes to binge drinking. But we definitely do lack a ritual around transition from boy to man, from my point of view as well.
Yeah, we do. And one of the reasons, I'm sure, the Duke of Edinburgh scheme, I'm a huge fan of that. And you see people out all the time doing it. It's the most popular thing in the Duke of Edinburgh scheme is that hike, that 50-mile hike, because it's a real challenge. And it's not terribly dangerous. It could be a little bit risky in some places, but the whole point is you learn to manage that risk. And you don't know where you're going to sleep at night. And that is the sort of essence of adventure. So you learn how to combat sort of maybe the anxiety of that. So these are really quite easy to achieve rites of passage for that people can design for themselves. And when I was 25, I put it into the book, I was sort of at a total loose end about what I should do. Lots of projects I'd done had failed. So I decided to walk the Pyrenees from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic. And that really did feel like a rite of passage because it was a 400-mile mountainous walk. And so I think people can design rites of passages for themselves. It's just not built into the culture. We don't have an opt-out. Lots of traditional cultures are opt-out. Everything's built in. So you just have to go along with it. We now have an opt-in culture. And if you're not a kind of, pushy or interested or motivated person, you will just be left on the side.
It's so easy to coast, and I really, really rail against that in all these discussions that I have, Robert, for living your life on autopilot. Yeah. And again, to kind of break that third wall, when we were speaking before we hit record, we were talking about the fact that life can seem very quickly if you just always do the same things day to day, because there's no novelty, and it's very hard to identify particular moments when you did something different, or when something happened that you can recall quite clearly, even though it was a longer period of time ago, because we do typically just have this, or if we choose to, we can have a very mundane existence if we don't opt out of that, as you said, and choose to do something a little bit more unusual, or something that stays with us.
Yeah, it's true. And when I'm, you have these moments where you kind of look back on your life, and the things that I look back on, and not really having written books, it's the trips I've done. Those are the things I'm most grateful to have done. And even at the time, some of them were were quite awful in places. Most of the time they weren't, but some of the time, it's still, it does feel a worthwhile thing to have done. So yeah, we relinquish that at our peril, I think, in favour of a more comfortable and secure existence.
Comfort and convenience is a really seductive place to be, but as you mentioned with the men's mental health challenges that we're seeing, it's not a place that we truly want to be. We want to be there from a position of, oh, it feels quite nice and at that moment in time. But as you've quite rightly illustrated, and as I'm saying in terms of some of the conversations that I've had, many people realize, and they wake up and they think, this life actually isn't for me, because I'm not in a position where I feel strain and stress and challenge, and I feel like I'm progressing or doing something that is having meaning to it. And I like that you use the example of going on that long walk through the Pyrenees, and it being a highly novel experience that all those years ago you can think back to and think, that was like me kind of becoming a bit more of a man. And I actually heard you say previously that in the 25 years before that, you were at a bit of a wash. You weren't particularly robust as a man at that point in time. You were a boy by all accounts, but when you came back, you'd put your body and your mind through something that was different.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the. If there could be one characteristic, which of course all is shared by men and women, of course, but it's more emphasized for men, and that's courage. And how do you grow courage? Because one of the problems in our society is that we seem to think that courage is something that just drops out of a tree, and but it isn't. I mean, most kids are cowards. I mean, everyone knows that. When you're a kid, someone gets. I think there was a Simpsons thing where everyone gets hurt and everyone runs off, and I thought, that's so real. That's what kids do, and you shouldn't criticize kids for that, because they haven't learned. It's self-preservation. Being cowardly is self-preservation, and a kid who isn't a coward is probably a loon or a nut. So, but over time, you learn how to be courageous. You learn lots of small skills. There are lots of small skills. It's not some sort of just like one big kind of like thing in your head that says, no, I'm a courageous person, because it's connected to competence, and it's connected to insight and foresight and all sorts of other things. So these are the things that you're learning as you're getting older and going into your 20s. And so how do you build courage? Because without courage, you can't. There are many things you just can't do. No matter how much you might want to do them, you really need. You may not be able to help people. If there's an altercation and someone's being bullied, you may not be able to help them if you don't have courage. You may want to. So how do you build that baseline courage? And you have to put yourself in unusual situations. You have to put yourself in places where you are stripped of your normal comfort zone and feel like a little kid. And that's all kinds of situations, not just physically challenging ones. But the physically challenging ones are a good one to start.
I think a lot of men and a lot of my audience are very interested in their health and their fitness. That can be quite a good way to test your courage and your fortitude, because you put your body through a strain that they've not necessarily been through before. And of course, your mind quite often wants to quit before your body does, because it's telling you to get back to a place of comfort, whether that's an endurance event, a strength feat, or some form of long walk or a long run or whatever, where there is an element of like directional planning as well, because that adds an additional stress and strain to it as well. And I can completely see, in terms of courage, I used a really corny phrase when I was talking to a psychologist in the podcast recently, a gentleman called Dr. Arya. I said, we bleed in training so we don't die in war. And it was very corny at the time, but it resonated with a lot of the listeners because they were thinking, well, of course, when it comes to things like courage, these micro exposures build up over time where you actually reinforce this character and this identity trait of yourself as a courageous individual because you've proven it to yourself numerous times. So when perhaps the big test or the storm does come, you are far better equipped to deal with it than if you've maybe lived a life of relative comfort and ease up until that point, and then something does hit you in life that should really quite challenge you. You're not as prepared.
Yeah, and I think courage is natural. You know, that actually we have a natural desire to be courageous. We kind of know what courageous action is. We've got all the software, if you see what I mean. And to sort of run the program, you often, as you say, you just need to have that experience and build up to it and trust in your various capabilities. You know, and obviously physical strength is one of them, and having been put in unfamiliar situations. So it's, I mean, I remember talking to a guy who'd been in, he was the only or one of the few MCs to have been awarded in Iraq in the Iraq invasion in 2003 on the British side. And he held a police station against multiple attacks. And he said, the thing is, courage was normal because if you join the army, you probably already are, you know, likely to be courageous, and you've got the right training, and you know you're physically fit. So it's just lots of the lads were concerned they might not be brave, but they all were, you know, and so you can sort of rest easy. It's not like some kind of I mean, well, part of the problems of all this sort of, I mean, I read these sort of books, you know, these SAS adventure books, and you know, they're a good laugh, but it creates an idea in society that there's this sort of elite bunch of blokes who are somehow completely different. I mean, no, you know, almost all men in my experience are courageous or have within them that capacity, and it just needs some bringing out and some extra experiences, and they don't need to sort of put on a pedestal a whole bunch of people who are, you know, specially trained for certain types of warfare.
Yeah, there's elements of nature and nurture and all these things, isn't there? And some people definitely have a higher potential ceiling, but as you said, many men have a potential that they haven't even begun to try and work on and realize because they've shied away potentially from that in all regards. But you're mentioning the army there. Of course, those individuals are those that have maybe tapped into that or went into that far more frequently. So when the attack comes or the situation, they kind of demonstrate that on what we would deem for an average person like almost a superhuman level. You think, oh wow. But if courage and right to passage are two of your four factors, what are the other two, Robert?
You might have to tell me. It's 20 years since I wrote the book, and
I've got it written down.
I might have changed them since then. Well, tell me what I did say. What did I say?
One of them was killing a beast.
Yeah.
And I wonder what you meant by that.
Killing a beast. That's a common. If you look at rites of passage all over the world, killing a beast or a member of the opposing tribe, often head-taking cultures and so on, or raiding cultures, and you know the two could be combined. You know, in a raiding culture, it would be stealing beasts from other people, but I think it's the idea of confronting something that is stronger than yourself and defeating it, either with tools, strategy, cleverness, or sheer aggression. And it's you see it in things like the bullfight. You see it in these sort of ritualized versions of this rite of passage, and of course in modern warfare. You see it in, you know, the beast is the opposite number. It is the enemy. So I think that it's about thinking about what would constitute this entity that is bigger and stronger and more fierce than you, and how are you going to conquer it, and how are you going to deal with it. And
one of the things that I wrote down when I was thinking about that particular factor was the capacity, capability to consider how you would have to behave when confronted with something as challenging as that?
Yeah.
And do you deem yourself capable of standing up to that? So if the situation arose, could you stand up for yourself and for those around you from a physical perspective? Could you not kill is obviously a strong term, but could you execute on a really violent act if you needed to protect yourself and your family? Is that a consideration that men should have to do potentially, because that is a masculine trait to protect and to serve those that you feel like you have a duty of care for?
Yeah. I mean, in my own, it's funny you should mention it because, well, first of all, for nervous listeners, that is those 4 criteria. You didn't have to do all 4. You know, it wasn't like a merit
A
badge.
checklist.
You could choose any one of the 4, and one of them is much less demanding. I think we'll get to that one. But a few years after I wrote that book, I was in Canada, and we had been told of a really good camping spot by the side of this remote river in very far north of Canada. And it was a good camping spot because there was loads of fish there. Unfortunately, lots of Indians had been fishing on there for hundreds of years, so it was really well known to bears. And we woke up in the morning, and there were bears across the river, bears across the stream, and I could hear one coming through these willows towards me. I mean, and a bear coming through willows, it sounds unnaturally large. It sounds like a massive bloke pushing his way through the undergrowth. And I thought, what, you know, I knew it was a black bear, and black bears you can't run from. That's the thing. It's not. I mean, most bears you shouldn't run from, but particularly black bears, they do fake charges. So I knew that. So that's a constituent of courage, which is information. Didn't I had this thing which we called the bear horn, but it was actually an aerosol can horn. You know, you get them on pleasure boats, and it makes a really loud noise, and it's used by researchers who deal with black bears and grizzly bears. It's supposed to work. Well, it worked about 50% of the time. When I pressed it, it ran out of air. It just made this really sort of pathetic,
A whimpering noise.
a whimper. Yeah, it's not a bang, a whimper. And so I thought, oh, what can I do? Okay, so in the fire was this. I got the fire going early in the morning, and I got out this big, long, you know, it was more than a stick. It was, you know, a good couple of inches wide, and it was all glowing embers at one end. And I thought, okay, if I root that in the ground, and the bear comes at me, I'm going to thrust that right in its mouth, and it may get me, but that is going to really hurt. So that's what I did. Stood there like that, and bear came through the bushes, and it stopped about 5 feet away from me, and it kind of looked at me, and it looked at the glowing stick, and it just turned around and legged it. So, you know, that was you know, by accident confronting a beast, but it was also shows how you know, I've done quite a lot of reading about bears, and I talked to people about them. So I kind of knew, and I had even at the back of my mind a guy who told me a black bear had come into his camp while he was eating ice cream and had stood like menacing him, and he'd thrown the spoon at its face, and it had run off. So I did know that, and I had heard accounts of people who turned and run holding mess tins with food in, and the bear had gone after the mess tin with food, and they'd been collateral damage and had been very badly injured. So I knew a lot of what needed to be done, and I just knew, just do that. So these are all sort of elements which facing the beast will bring out in you.
And within that, you had the capabilities to strike it with a flaming stick if you needed to, which I think is important as well, because you didn't have qualms in your mind about what that might mean. And I know that you pursued martial arts as well in order to kind of push back against this kind of loss of masculinity as well. And I have been physically training for a very, very long time, primarily bodybuilding, strength training. But this year I started boxing training because I believe that not only should I look physically capable of defending myself and perhaps be somebody that people are, oh, he's muscular and strong, but should I have some form of capability within myself as well? And that's played a big role in me feeling like a strong, masculine, positive presence around those around me by being able to use my fists, but albeit almost never, hopefully ever have to use them in that regard other than punching pads or doing a little bit of sparring. And I think that's an important thing for men to consider as well, that almost capability of being dangerous should you require to be.
I think so. I think you've got to. I mean, the amazing thing is that there are lots of weapons to hand. So in a way, I remember before I did martial arts, I was really good at finding weapons immediately to hand. Even something like those old style magazines that were really thick, full of advertisements. If you rolled one up really tight, that is quite a nasty weapon if you shove it up someone's nose or something. And often if you've done a martial art that's very specific, like boxing or karate, you might be tempted to just use your fists because you become so good at them. Whereas there may be a very heavy glass ashtray that might be of more use on the table. I mean, I'm just talking in a sort of theoretical way here, but certainly those sorts of training like boxing, like Aikido or karate, I think is really valuable because it puts you in the mindset of thinking that you are competent to deal with. And many of times you weren't, because sometimes you can meet somebody who's an absolute monster, and it'd be madness to, they're just going to crush you. But a lot of the time, but even if you, in order to assess that, you might have to have done this training anyway to sort of know them. And you probably had this experience. Sometimes someone who's really big and is used to intimidating people gets very, very close to you. So you realize they don't actually know anything about martial arts. What they've done is they've just intimidated people a lot, and they're actually very vulnerable because they become so close to you. But all of that knowledge comes from doing it, and I think it's very empowering. And I think all boys should. Boxing used to be a thing people did at school. I'm not necessarily. I mean, it's not very nice getting punched in the face, but there are lots of others: wrestling, judo. And I think judo is a bit boring. That's the problem with judo. But for kids,
a lot of the time though, these things are also teaching you restraint as well. So learning the capability of these things, but choosing not to use it unless absolutely vital, which is an important strand to, in my opinion, a positive expression of masculinity is control and being able to dictate on your own terms when you use your aggression and when you're required to do these things. But you were mentioning for nervous listeners, you don't necessarily have to do all of these things. And the fourth and final one that I know you spoke about was the ability to have like basic skills and capabilities in terms of with your hands. What were the kind of things that you were considering when you wrote about
that? I was thinking about, the most basic hand skills, the ability to use a knife, to carve things, to make objects out of wood, to skin something. These are things people have been using their hands for thousands, if not possibly even millions of years. We know that, proto-man used stone tools. And I think there's a huge amount of intelligence. It makes sense to think of there being intelligence in our hands. I mean, one point I was working on a building site with this Irish foreman. He was an illiterate, couldn't read or write. But when he got a spade in his hands, the way he could use it just showed a real kind of dexterity and intelligence. So I think that's a really important aspect of us. And unfortunately, modern schooling, it's a bit hit and miss whether kids get that. I mean, and it might take them later. I think people do different things at different speeds and at different times. So it's not tragic that you don't learn how to use your hands at school, but it might create a blockage. So later you don't go into it. But I do think that it's a crucial part of competence and a sense. I think what we're circling here is this feeling of competence, that men have had that sense of competence taken away from them because the culture has been against it, and they need, or it's been replaced with sort of bogus forms of competence, which involve money and status,
other means of status symbols.
Just sort of artificial. So, but competence,
exactly.
hands. The guy who can fix things. We all know that. Probably had relatives. Guy who could fix anything. I mean, that's a brilliant thing to be able to do.
It's funny, when I was reading that, I felt not attacked, but definitely criticised, because I look to my dad as somebody that does so much of the DIY around the flat that my brother and I bought together, and he is. It doesn't matter what it is. He has an ability of doing that, and he's not trained as a tradesman, a joiner, a plumber, or anything like that. But he will quite happily have a go at it, and more often not have a relatively good answer to it. And I consider myself, and I don't want to say handless, but compared to him, I'm not capable like that. And it's not something that there wasn't a focus on me or focus for me to do until I maybe spoke to people like yourself, read your content, and maybe thought about maybe there is something at play there when it comes to men not having the same skill set that they did in previous years. That was just normal to my dad, as he was an educated man, an engineer. Like, there was no requirement for him to do these things, but he just chose to, because that's what it kind of meant to be a man. And he's in his 70s now, so born in the early 1950s. So that's definitely changed in the last few years.
Yeah, but I think, I mean, it's not on the curriculum, so you've got to do it yourself. Again, it's an opt-in occupation, but there is loads of ways of getting into it. I mean, and I got into woodwork. I wasn't really particularly handy, but in my early 30s, I got into tools and buying really, hand tools, really, really good chisels and stuff. I didn't really know how it worked, and reading books about them then. But I suppose you can easily read videos and learn how to sharpen them. I mean, it was a big deal for me to actually learn how to sharpen things properly, because for years I hadn't really known how to get a really sharp edge on something, because it's kind of hit and miss unless you know how to do it. So learning all those things, I mean, I learned it later, but and sometimes it's good to get power tools to start with, because hand tools kind of don't, if you don't know how to use them, they can be a bit baffling. And then you work backwards. So I've seen people who start with all the power tools and start making things, and it looks good because it's all sharp and well finished. And then they work backwards towards hand tools, so they're then getting more of that traditional skill. So it's again a case of using the technology now. Like I was saying with photography, you could start with a digital camera or a phone and then move back to traditional analog camera. So there's lots of options.
Getting an early win in anything can create momentum and allow you to go deeper down the rabbit hole, because it's almost like a proof of concept or a proof that something works, and it gives you a positive feedback loop. In any habit formation I ever try and do, if I can get an early piece of positive feedback, then I'm far more likely to repeat it and go again, and then perhaps build up the challenge or build up the inertia and try and overcome that. But only once I've gathered maybe a little bit of momentum running down the hill, the kind of snowball rolling. Whereas if I'm going from a standing start, it's far more difficult. And I suppose if you use technology in a positive way, it gives you that initial benefit from that perspective. So we've spoken about those 4 factors and a number of different things linked to it. What other things would you recommend men listening to this do to try and reclaim elements of their manhood and their masculinity in the modern world?
Read all my books. No, apart from that one. A later book I did is a book called Micro Mastery, and that was the idea of. I mean, mastery is part of a sort of male. The idea of yourself being a master of something, and yet it can be seen very daunting, because you're told you've got to spend 10,000 hours, and you've got to spend 5 years as an apprentice, and so it becomes a bit of a depressing kind of concept. So I came up with this idea of micro mastery. If you really, really focus on one thing, and I took the example of making an omelette. So I decided to totally focus on that rather than becoming a top chef. And so I looked at lots of videos on YouTube, and I realized there's loads of real rubbish out there. So if you go in blind, it's really difficult. So then I thought, you've got to look at recipe books written by masters from the past, talk to chefs, and I did all of this, and I gradually was able to see what is needed to make a perfect omelette. And it's often used as a test case for how good a chef is. So I focused on that, and eventually I became really good. And I'm really good at making omelettes, and I know lots about them. And it feels very satisfying, because every now and again, you're in a situation where you need to cook an omelette. People go, "Oh, that's good." So take those specific items, because I suppose what I'm saying is what we mentioned earlier. The world is so complicated, so much information, so many possible avenues. You've got to just zoom in, so narrow it right down, and just master if you have these micro masteries, they can give you great confidence, like you're saying, to build forward. They're great for focusing, and they aren't going to take the rest of your life to do, and they can be a way in to the subject. So certainly once I started the omelette thing, I thought, oh, okay, now I understand why people do that in cooking. And then you get something else. And then I started going into another dish I really like, spaghetti bolognese, and looking into everything about that. So it's sort of like a manageable way into things. So I would say that would be, if you're feeling feeling down, the two elements I'm always promoting are long distance walks in remote countries to sort of get a challenge, and micro mastery as a way of finding a way into something without having to totally commit to it. I mean, you know, let's say you want to make the perfect, you know, three chord song, you know, or play some, you know, Smoke on the Water the best way you can. You know, take something very, very small and perfect it. And then find
And
out
there's
if it's
that
you.
positive feedback loop of competence, as
Yeah,
you say, and two of the terms that I used were purpose and mission. And although those aren't like world famous missions that are going to make you well known or massively well regarded, they will give you a sense of achievement because you've chosen to work on something that you couldn't do previously, and now you have an element of, oh, Rob's really good at that,
yeah,
Colin's really good at that, and that's a really tremendous thing for a man because you feel that element of like I've gone from 0 to 100, or it
yeah.
might even not be 100, it might be 0 to 80 or 0 to 50 depending on what you're working on in that particular field, and that has an element of real positivity to it. And I think that's one of the things that people nowadays, when they use phrases like toxic masculinity, seriously misunderstand, because men who have mastery and have confidence and competence are actually fantastic to be
Of course
around.
they
They're
are. Yeah,
much less likely to be mopey. They're much less likely to be unhappy. They're much less likely to be a burden to society. They're much less likely to kill themselves, which is something that we're going through an unprecedentedly high level of that during this time, which is devastating and really quite troubling. So by people having a positive expression of masculinity and gaining all these positive traits that you and I have spoken about, we actually end up with a better society for men and for women.
completely. I mean, those sort of people you're talking about who have competence are often the ones who are the most likely to encourage women to do things that they're interested in, if it's even if it's the same area. So it's a win all round. I mean, it's. I think we're saying is everyone or people want to be useful. You know, that's a kind of that's built into us. We want to be useful. We want to be helpful. We want to be involved. You know, we want all these things, and it's really hard to do it. And getting a job in a call center doesn't feel very useful. You know, I mean, it's just too removed, and so it's really quite hard to sort of find that. I mean, let's say you're brought up on a farm. It's quite easy to be useful there. You know, there's kind of lots of things where you make a difference because then otherwise, you know, the
You
crops
have
will
a
die.
role to play.
Yeah,
Yeah, it is fascinating when you think about how, when we do strip things back, it's sometimes far more easy to find where you fit within this great puzzle of life. You're the
yeah,
kind of jigsaw slot that you slot into, and it can be multiple, as you were talking about, in terms of different levels of mastery and different domains. But it is fascinating to sometimes step back from 2023 or 2002 when your book was released, and understand that we don't necessarily have to stay on the tracks that were being taken down in the modern world.
absolutely. You know, and one of the things I did, which was a breakthrough for me, which may also be of interest to people wishing to pursue unusual paths, is you can actually earn all the money you need. When I was living in Japan, which in those days was one of the most expensive countries to live in the late 90s, and I earned everything I needed in one day of the week. I would start work at 7 a.m. and finish at 10, and teaching English, and you know, cut back my life considerably. But the rest of the time I spent doing martial arts. So it proved that was a breakthrough because I'd always thought, oh yeah, you've got to have a 5 day a week job. You know, you've got to be like every other muggins. And of course, when you work 5 days a week, you think you've deserved those 2 days a week to go down the pub or whatever you want to do. And so your life is just flashing by. If you cut it down to 2 days a week, if you can find yourself a way of earning enough money to live for 2 days a week. And again, we're now back into this whole problem in the UK of expensive property, utilities. It's militating against that. But if you can do that and have 5 days free to do something else that's more meaningful, more useful, then you're going to be a hell of a lot happier and progressing in the direction you want to go in.
I'm a big fan of that message to wrap up on, Robin. I think it's a really positive note for people to consider, because as you say, you can be a conformist to general society, but if you look at the average man, the average woman, they're not particularly happy. So let's buck that trend and do something different that we can feel a little bit more aligned doing. And Rob, I've loved this conversation. I'm sure the listeners have as well. Where should they head towards if they want to continue the conversation with you and check out more of your stuff?
Well, I mean, pretty much all of my books are on Amazon, or dare I say it, also eBay. And I've got this blog. I mean, it's got 1,000 articles on. I mean, it's going back now over 10 years. So some of this stuff was on the blog. Some of the stuff is on. You can buy books on Amazon. I also do a newsletter with 2 other guys about micromastery, which has some stuff in, which you can sign up to. That's a Substack newsletter called Micromastery. So yeah. I mean, my website.
I can link the website and the blog and the email newsletter in the show notes. And if people are keen to get involved with the being a man in the lousy modern world, they can definitely find it on Amazon or eBay, as you said. But thank you so much to you, Rob, and thank you to you, the listener. I'll be back to speak to you all again very, very soon.